Once again, my name is Jenny Herrera. I'm the CEO of the Good Business Charter, and it is great to have you join us today for this panel on inclusive and supportive workplaces. Most of you are from our accredited organisations, but if you're not, just a quick reminder that the Good Business Charter is about a benchmark for responsible business behaviour over 10 components, and 5 of those components are all about your staff, your colleagues, your people. The first one is real living wage. The second one is about a fair approach to 0 hours contracts if you use them. And then the other 3 are the ones that we're really likely to focus on today: employee wellbeing, employee representation, and equality, diversity and inclusion. What does that look like when we've got a big team? How are we making sure that we are caring for our people? And I'm really excited to be joined today by 3 speakers: Mark from Capita, Anthony from Aviva, and Lutfur from the CIPD. So we've chatted them ahead. We think they're going to bring different perspectives, and we're then going to open the floor for questions as well. So as you're listening, if you get a little question, feel free to pop it in the chat while we're going on, or write it down and we can bring them in later. Mark has to shoot off, so Hannah is going to instead answer any questions from a Capita perspective when we get to that stage. But I don't want to be talking lots. We really want to benefit from our expert speakers today. So I am going to hand over first to, and let me just get my order in place, to Mark Campion. He's Group Head of Wellbeing and Occupational Health at Capita, to come and tell us a little bit about what you do for employee wellbeing. So over to you, Mark.
Great, thank you very much, Jenny. I'm delighted to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, from whatever locations you're at. So, as Jenny said, I've only got kind of a short sort of 10 minutes or so to talk. So, and primarily, as Jenny said, I'm the Group Head of Wellbeing and Occupational Health here at Capita. One of the things that I think is really, really crucial with what I do, and pretty much I almost say the same thing almost every single day that I come to work, is just reminding people what it is when we actually talk about well-being, because it is a term that's used so much nowadays. And like what I try to remind, especially our board and some of our more senior leaders, is when we talk about well-being, or certainly when I talk about well-being, I'm not necessarily just talking about reducing absenteeism. I'm not talking just about attrition. I'm not just talking about some of the sort of the KPIs and the metrics that from a workplace and from an organizational perspective, lots of people kind of associate to well-being. When I talk about well-being, and Jenny, delighted to hear you say the word, we're talking about people, we're talking about human beings. And that's really what I'm trying to really drive at Capita, is actually just making people realise within the organisation, we are not talking about numbers, we are just talking about real human beings with real lives who are impacted by the real things that we're all impacted. So when we talk about well-being from a workplace perspective, we're talking about, all the things that we do at work that impacts on well-being, but we're also talking about all of the factors outside of the workplace that have a huge impact on our employees' well-being. So that's the holistic view that I think has to be when, and that's something that I think is very, very different now to even when I first started to talk about wellbeing 10 years ago. It's just how holistic it's become. And you'll be very, very short-sighted if you built a wellbeing strategy that was just really kind of looking at it from a workplace perspective. So that's the first thing that I really like to kind of share with people, is to make sure you think very, very widely, very, very holistically, and you think human beings. We are talking about a group of people with so many different kind of things that might impact us. So well-being overall, just to remind us all what well-being actually is, it's about feeling good, it's about functioning well, it's about experiencing positive emotions and happiness, developing your potential, having sort of control and a bit of sense of purpose about what we do, positive relationships. Now, these are things, just going back to the human being element, that are inside the workplace and outside the workplace. And again, if you think of all the pillars of well-being that we're all very familiar with, or hopefully familiar with, physical, mental, social, financial, for example, you just start to see how these things kind of all join together. So when I've built the sort of strategy and what we do at Capita, that's first and foremost how we approach it. So we think about all of the things that we do internally. We think about all of the things that potentially might be happening to people outside of the workplace. And then we try to build the strategy around that. So it's really important to kind of think of like the basics. So, you know, wellbeing isn't just about having, you know, an EAP or having like, you know, wellbeing events or initiatives and things like that. It's actually about every single thing that happens in the organization. So it goes right down to just even the way that we speak to each other and how we develop our culture and how our senior leadership team operate, the words that they use. So quite often, John Lewis, our CEO, has like monthly sessions, and he gets all of his senior leadership team together. Now, you know, one of the first things he talks about, you know, at the very beginning of those sessions and throughout those sessions is well-being and people and how are people feeling. You can imagine when you've got a large organization like Capita, where we've got 50,000 people and all of the senior leadership team. Firstly, it's, you know, we have regular sessions with our CEO and our senior leaders. So straight away, you can see that the sort of the wide impact it will have when you hear our CEO talk about it. And that's why, from a strategic perspective, you know, it's making sure that, you know, the kind of key leaders in our organization talk about well-being, so that culturally it filters through. And it's not just so that they, you know, tick a box and they say, yeah, that's fine, I'm a sponsor of one of the wellbeing groups. It's actually really drumming it into them so that they believe it, you know, they actually, you know, really value that. It's really true to them and to their hearts as well. Now, sometimes that might not be easy, you know. We're driven by commercial aspects, we're driven by lots of other factors, but you have to kind of get that really kind of intrinsically into the way they behave and a true value from their perspective as well. So, you know, once we've established that, you know, the people are the most important part of the organization, the rest of the stuff, all of the components and the enablers and the environments that we all work in, it just all kind of joins together. And you just need to work your way around those things. So I'll just probably explain a little bit more about some of those things that I'm talking about. So when I talk about environments, I'm not just talking about the office space and how it looks and feels. You know, they're very kind of, you know, material aspects, but they play a part, because clearly, you know, if you come to the workplace, you want it to look nice, to feel that, you know, you've got things around you that make you feel better, you know, so you can function well, changing facilities, you know, all of those things that we talk about traditionally with wellbeing. But the other thing is that, you know, there's it's back to the culture thing. You know, the environment is that we have people that can do a job, and if you think of the HSE kind of risks to stress in the workplace, the workload is right and balanced, and it's enough to push you but not to over push you, and all of those sorts of things that you need to get right. Now, all of that comes with actually understanding the people. So another kind of key component to wellbeing is that we've got a kind of way that we manage and the way that we do things and the way that our managers look after our people. And that's right from, a basic team leader up to a senior leader. You're always looking after people, and it doesn't matter how high, the hierarchy or whatever level you are. If you look after somebody, it's your responsibility to make sure that, we're not impacting their well-being. And it's also your responsibility to make sure that we help them if they come to you and they tell you about situations outside of, from a workplace perspective, outside and things that are happening in their personal lives. So that's really what I kind of drum into. How do we operate and how our managers deal with people? So, everybody talks about one-to-ones, but do we genuinely kind of make sure we allow the time and say to people, how are you doing? How's things? How's your family? How's this? How's things? Because you got to know, you need to spend time to get to know the person. Now, it's really difficult. Some people have huge teams that they manage, and we understand that. But you've got to start somewhere. You've got to have, as part of that management style and that management commitment, you've got to have something in place where you can talk to people and they know that there is an outlet, no matter what the frequency, but as long as it's there in some way, shape or form. And that's the only time that you will actually start to notice differences, is if you actually understand your people. So then you'll realize that actually something's not quite right, or something's, maybe that something from a workplace perspective has gone wrong, or something outside the workplace has potentially gone wrong. So that's another key bit for me. From a wellbeing strategy perspective, it's really focusing on that component of how managers look after their people. Now that, there is a huge responsibility for those managers. We know that, and their time is short, their capacity is short, but we need to just make that a bit of a bedrock, and challenge it when it doesn't happen. If people don't have the time to have those meetings to ask people how they're doing, that's when things go wrong. We've recently had a poll survey, for example. One of the key questions there is that, people, do you talk about wellbeing in your teams? Do you feel that you're well supported? Can you manage stress levels? Those, if you actually think about survey if you asked all these questions, and then think backwards to say, well, have I got things in place that make this happen? Do we talk about wellbeing? You don't necessarily need to make it mandatory, but you can encourage people to say, look, every team meeting, why don't we start off with a wellbeing moment? 5 minutes long, start of every call. How's everybody doing? Did you see that, this particular health thing, or have we talked about stress? Are you aware of, some stress support that we've got to work? Really simple things that you can pick up from, because if you know your team, you'll know that these are the things that they're talking about. These are the things that they're impacted. And it's that culture that really makes a difference for people, because it's all about making people feel valued. It's all about making people feel cared about, and that's when you start to see the benefits in terms of performance, in terms of attrition rates and all those things. But more importantly, that you start to see people say, do you know what, I like working for Capita because they genuinely care about me, and they look after me. I've got lots of support around me. So those are the things that I kind of look out for when I'm thinking about the sort of wellbeing and a strategy. And I always think about it almost like from a safeguarding perspective. Hopefully you'll, if you're certainly involved in wellbeing, supportive, inclusive, and this sort of environment, you're aware of what safeguarding is. And it's all about protecting people from harm, and it's all about looking after people. Now that's, that I feel that we've got a duty of care to do that from an employer's perspective. We need to look after people to make sure that we've got those factors in place, those enablers, the environments, the culture, and all the things that I've said. And then just when we notice that things are going wrong outside, going back to my point at the very start, we're all human beings. When you notice those things, that we do something about it, because you can't ignore it. As far as I'm concerned, that's neglect, and that these are the kind of the way that I operate it from a wellbeing strategy perspective, is I think of it very much as almost like a safeguarding strategy. How can we make sure we're protecting our people from harm? And it's all of those factors that come into play. So we've got lots of things that we've got to help with that. Now, I'm conscious of time. So Hannah Winter, my colleague, is going to be taking questions at the end. She's got all the information I've pulled together, and I've kind of provided some of that key support in terms of what we do at Capita, and some of those things and examples of how we bring to life those human elements and those sorts of things. So hopefully that's given you some kind of insight into what we do. I think we're doing really well. We've certainly got a wellbeing culture. People talk about it all of the time. I don't want to use the word buzzword, but it is something that crops up all the time. And my time is always in demand to go and speak to people, to join team meetings and senior leadership teams. And that's great, because that tells me that it's working, because people want me to go along and remind people about what's available. And I always say that bit at the beginning, we're talking about human beings. We're talking about, it's the really simple things that matter. I call it frontline wellbeing. Managers just checking in on people, making sure they're okay. If you get those basics right, the wellbeing strategy in terms of the environments and the support that we've got in the EAPs and the Occ Health, that's the easy stuff. That's stuff that's really simple to do. So if we get the bare basics right, and it comes from a genuinely caring kind of environment, we love that saying of we care about ourselves and we care about each other, words that we use quite often. So that's me. Appreciate your time and listening to me ramble on. I'm extremely passionate about it. So as I said, my colleague Hannah can answer any questions, and hopefully that's been of use to people.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Mark. And it is, isn't it? It's about people and treating people like people. And you think, well, it's not rocket science, but it's from that starting point that everything flows. And Julian Richer, our founder, always says it's all about the people. And this is where it all starts. So that was great. And we look forward to hearing from Hannah later in the questions. Thanks so much for your time, Mark.
No worries.
And I'd now like to hand over to Anthony Fitzpatrick. He is Head of Colleague Experience and Employment Policy at Aviva. Over to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you to everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about employee representation, because as that is one of the key elements within the Good Business Charter. And my background is very much in industrial relations, employee relations, and now kind of expanding that into what we like to call colleague experience. And I think it very much links, Jenny, to what you were just saying there and what Mark was talking about in terms of, underpinning this. It's a really simple philosophy. This is about how we engage with our people, and our people are our key asset. Whatever line of business we're in, our people are our key asset. And we all have a voice. Everybody wants to feel that they're engaged, that they're important, that they've got an opportunity to contribute to the conversation. So my take on employee representation is, clearly there are some legal niceties that we have to ensure that we are adhering to. My talk today, and there are no slides, you'll be pleased to know, is very much focusing on, actually, we know we have to do the legal things, so we just have to get on and do that. What's the other part of employee representation where actually I believe you can make a difference, and you can make a difference to how people feel, and in terms of what impact that has on their employee engagement in the wider context, and where's the business benefit to that? So I look back in 2005, we had a long-standing arrangement, and still do have a long-standing arrangement with a fully recognised trade union. However, we recognised even then that people's outlook was changing, and not as many people were joining trade unions, although given the current wave of industrial disputes, that might feel a little bit juxtaposed. But in the main, we recognized that the trade union had a voice, but also how did we tap into engaging those colleagues who wanted a voice, but didn't necessarily want to do that through the formal mechanism of joining a trade union. So we set up a fully elected employee council, and that's been running now since 2005. And that's open to all employees at all grades up to senior management level. And we align that around our business operating model. And they really are the main vehicle for, one, discharging our legal obligations. The trade union are members of that council and sit at the table. So we try to make it collaborative rather than a kind of tripartite conversation. But also what we wanted to do was really start to think about the basic premise of information sharing, consultation, which is the legal niceties, and then engagement. So for us, it was about creating the right model, the right vehicle, that was meaningful, that people could tap into that easily. Simplicity, I would say, when thinking about employee representation, actually the simpler the better. Because I think the more we overcomplicate things and the more we kind of get into rules and regulations, that's when actually I think it starts to maybe detract from the value of the conversation. So I would say, in terms of from the Good Business Charter, when we think about employee representation, actually, I don't think it has to be an onerous and an overly legalistic approach. I think there are many ways that we can engage with our colleagues and with our teams in a meaningful way that's engaging, is collaborative, it's creative, taps into ideas, and actually will enhance and drive employee engagement, what our customers receive, but also in terms of to really drive our businesses forward. So kind of taking that to the next level then, my thing is in terms of, have regular conversations, regular access to the right level of decision makers. Because what you don't want to create is in a sense of this kind of very mysterious top level, executive level that seems to be making all the decisions. And then how does that feel maybe further down into the organization for people who maybe are at the front line, who don't necessarily have that access? So what you want to do is open that, remove those barriers, and create that meaningful discussion. So for me, it's about coming and sharing where those ideas are, talking about the business strategy, what are our priorities, but also using that as a two-way instrument to say, look, here's what we want to talk about, but actually, how do we hear from you? What is it our people are talking about? What is it that's keeping them awake? What's the stuff that they're really passionate about? Using things like surveys, and I know surveys again is mentioned in the charter. They are very formal routes that you can get in. My thing through employee representation would be, it's just about the art of the conversation. Bringing people in, making that situation that, we want to hear from you. Your voice and your thought and your opinions are really, really important. And I think creating that culture of diversity of thought, diversity of opinion actually builds a stronger organization. One thing I would share is in terms of, and I've been doing this for a long time, is what I've always seen works really, really well is actually when you do create that ideas and improvements vehicle, and also thinking about communications. Because you've got a safe space with your safe space with your employee representatives, and actually just testing your thinking, testing your comms, because sometimes things can get lost in the delivery and maybe lost in the translation, and actually what you want to say and how that's said can actually either help and enhance, or it can actually do the opposite. So actually using those groups to say, look, here's our vision, here's our strategy, here's our priorities. And actually now how we're going to communicate that, creating that safe space where people can have a conversation, say, well, actually, if I was on the front line and I didn't have any of this context, how would that land with me? So my view is, I think there's really lots of great things that you can use the representative structures for. It doesn't necessarily have to be a trade union model. I think, that again has to be very much what suits your business and the employees within your business. So I'm not coming to advocate either way. All I would say is that voice, engagement, information sharing, and getting that collaborative approach of creativity and ideas, I think can really, really help. The final thing I say, because I know we've got about 10 to 12 minutes each, is really then thinking about what do you do with that information then when you've got it? Because, whether it's an employee survey or someone having that conversation and feeding back, there is nothing worse in my view than doing that, and then it just seems to go into a void and you don't get anything back. So my thoughts would be regular conversations with the right people and making sure that you do follow up on those actions and think about how then you can promote what you are doing with your representative groups to create that safe space that then people do feel that they're valued, their thoughts are taken. Now, it might be that we disagree, and one of my principles has always been, and working with trade unions for a long time as well, is actually it's not how we agree, but actually it's often how we disagree, because we may be fundamentally at opposite ends of the conversation, but actually it doesn't mean that we can't have a conversation, at least understand each other's perspective. We may not agree with it, but it's how we disagree. And that only really comes through regular, frequent conversations based around trust. Trust must underpin the philosophy of employee engagement and representation. And that really, I think, Jenny, kind of leads me into the final bit around thinking about the charter as well, thinking about kind of whistleblowing. And there are some excellent resources available. I know on your own website, you have a link through to Protect, the independent charity, which really offers advice on whistleblowing. But again, employee representation, whistleblowing, I think the concept is actually keep it simple, create the safe space, easy access, confidentiality, anonymity. All of that, I think, is quite within our grasp, whether that's a small, medium, or large organization. You can actually, I think, make a model that will work for your people and for the size of your organization. So keep it simple, make it meaningful, and just have regular, frequent conversations based on trust. That would be the key, I think, to really pushing forward on employee representation. So that's me, Jenny. I'll hand over back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Anthony. Hopefully you're all thinking, okay, so these are simple principles, and when we keep it simple, we are going to get a better engagement. And many of you will know we work closely with TUC, and they have a trustee representation on our board. And it's been interesting for me over the last few years to realise that employee representation is something we could do to talk about an awful lot more, because in general terms, people, they think they're doing it, but they're not really hearing from their employees in an effective way. And actually, if we hear from our people in an effective way, then all these other things are likely to fall into place more as well. We'll be more aware of where we might not be doing well on well-being, or where we might be failing to ensure everyone feels included. So that was really helpful. I'm sure there'll be questions later for you. And we are delighted to have Lutfur Ali from the CIPD, absolute experts in this area of people. And he is Senior Policy Advisor on Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. And so, as you all have heard, Capita, we did it nicely in order there. Mark from Capita looked at our employee wellbeing, which is our third component. Anthony has fleshed out a bit more about our employee representation, our fourth component. So now over to you, Lutfur, for our fifth component of EDI. You just need to unmute. Hang on a moment.
Sorry. I was just about to say, break from tradition from Anthony and Mark's eminent presentations. And I need some slides to aid some of the thoughts that I'm going to share. So first of all, thank you, Jenny, for the opportunity to be able to share some thoughts. Apologies to everybody for having a moment of being disorganized. I had some difficulties getting into the link today, and therefore I think the version of Zoom that I'm using is unable to sort of provide a background filter. So you're seeing my unkempt bedroom. So to bring in the sort of human component that Mark was talking about earlier, it's certainly very human in my case. A little bit more indulgence on your part, so I can try and upload and share my screen with you. And I hope you can all see this. Are you able to see this?
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. There we are. So I think I'm not sure there's very much I can add from both Mark and Anthony's contributions and the excellent work that they're doing in their organizations. But I hope that you won't take some of the ideas and thoughts that I'm about to present too negatively, but it's just really to sort of set the context as to while there is great work that's taking place, there is actually evidence to suggest that there's a lot more that we need to do. So I think we need to sort of look at sort of starting off from, and I think the bottom line's been mentioned in terms of, you know, organizational performance. I mean, most organizations, when they come to sort of look at questions of equality, diversity, inclusion, it's not always sort of seen in terms of, you know, profit, customer service and excellence. And I'm hoping to sort of, I can give you some ideas and share some thoughts about that. It is really fundamentally about that, especially if we sort of try and talk about, you know, looking at people in its widest possible context, both staff and customers. I mean, the question that I often pose is that if you don't see, you know, your staff and customers as diverse, you know, markets and groups, then you don't need EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion. But if you do, then this becomes quite fundamental to everything that an organization does. So I think the questions are around how can you harness the sort of full creativity and innovation of the entire workforce. Mark sort of referred to that in his sort of presentation around, you know, well-being, in terms of how do you motivate, how do you make sure that people are, you know, able to sort of contribute to their best of abilities in an organization. So when we look at sort of profit performance improvement, none of this can be achieved without people. People are diverse. They need to be treated with respect, fairness, and valued and empowered to feel belonging, be themselves, and celebrated for their difference. That's the sort of perspective in which we approach the questions of equality and diversity. We know that there's a war for talent out there. CIPD labour market research confirms or affirms that many employers are struggling to attract the best talent. You know, we know from ONS's latest sort of data, January to March, showing that 1.1 million job openings are out there. And also there's a high level of job quits, not just sort of, you know, as a consequence of the post-pandemic Great Resignation, but also societal expectations have changed over time, which means that, you know, people's attitudes have changed in terms of not wanting to work for employers who may not be treating their staff well.
Lutfur, can I just, we're still only on the first slide. I don't know if you can do the slideshow and go through, because we can't see the slide that you're on.
God.
Sorry to interrupt, just so that we're all following you at the same time. That would be good.
Is this moving to the next slide?
No. I think if you go up to slideshow and present, or present.
It is on present.
We can still only see the first slide at the moment.
The joys of technology. This might mean, I mean, what we can do is share these slides later.
Okay.
And it's consistent in keeping with both Anthony and Mark's presentation. And I think the gods of technology really want me to sort of speak rather than talk to slides.
Okay, so if you want to stop sharing your screen and then just talk to us, and we'll send the slides out to everyone afterwards.
That's absolutely fine.
Oh no, there we go. We can see it now. War for talent.
Oh, you can see it. Wonderful. That's absolutely fine. It's just that I've turned the slideshow off and it's working now. So there we are. And I think I was just sort of making the basic point that actually there's a disjoint between the way in which the availability of jobs are there and how people are struggling and finding it challenging. Many an employer finding it challenging to sort of recruit good quality talent. And also there's a piece of sort of PwC survey carried out a couple of years back, where they looked at sort of 10,000 people born between the years 1980, 1995. I think those years are taken as the term millennials. I don't use those terms. I mean, languages used because a lot of people don't understand what millennials mean, but that's effectively the age group that we're looking at. And over 80% said that an employer's policy on equality, diversity, inclusion is important. It was an important factor in enabling them to decide whether they wanted to work for that employer or not. So basically, people are voting with their feet whether to work for an employer who has effective equality, diversity, inclusion policies or not. let's see if we can move to the next bit of my notes. When we look at diversity markets, for example, and we don't often sort of see that as a significant marketplace, but it is. I mean, just to share with you some data, worldwide, the women buying market is worth $28 trillion. That's $28 trillion. That's what women's buying markets are. And the majority of household purchasing is undertaken and driven by women. So that's 28 trillion pounds. Black and ethnic minority market is estimated to be around 727 billion pounds just only in the UK. And that's estimated to grow to 16.7 trillion pounds by 2061. The disabled, the so-called purple pound, is worth around 274 billion pounds. That's 1 in 5 adults are disabled in the UK. That's 14.1 million people. LGBTQIA, the pink pound, is estimated to be worth around 6 billion pounds. Taken together, it's a significant market that I think employers and businesses need to be cognizant of. Moving on to looking at some of the main challenges from the CIPD survey that we found, looking at why there's still a continuing sort of difficulty in employers and organizations seeing equality, diversity, inclusion as a priority. 78% of the leaders said that they recognize the benefits of equality, diversity, inclusion, yet 52% of organizations don't even have an equality, diversity, inclusion strategy. That's more than half the people we surveyed. That's sort of 6,000 employers across the piece, large, medium, small businesses. 28% of leaders admitted that they only paid lip service. They only paid lip service to equality, diversity, inclusion issues, and 21% actually admitted to say they're not committed to EDI, which is remarkable. We were confounded at the results when they came in. 23% admitted that they felt uncomfortable talking about equality, diversity, inclusion, and 29% of organizations said that no tangible equality, diversity, inclusion action was being taken in their organization. A bleak picture painted by some of this sort of data coming through. We see leaders and managers in organizations often saying that equality and diversity and inclusion is front and center of their organizations. But what our data is revealing here is that actually a lot of this presentational, what we call EDI washing, isn't necessarily borne out by the evidence. So how do we ensure that equality, diversity, inclusion is business critical? And I think Mark earlier sort of mentioned taking a holistic approach. That's very much sort of advice that we're recommending that organizations take, that there isn't a one size fits all, that organizations need to understand what the challenges and priorities for their organizations are, and then look at how equality, diversity, inclusion can be a catalyst for change, can be a catalyst for business improvement, and certainly sort of looking at how it can add value to enhancing and strengthening the bottom line. How do you do this? It's really about looking at how the vision, mission, values of an organization, the business plans, the key strategic plans of an organizations can integrate equality, diversity, inclusion priorities. This goes back to the issue if you need to understand what your barriers and blockages are, what the biases and discriminatory practices and policies are in your organization before you can develop a plan. And it's all about tailoring it to the priorities and the positioning for where your own organization is at. Once this is understood, then action plans. I mean, this is none of what I'm saying is rocket science, but we need reminding again and again. Given that only 48% of organizations have an action plan, it's remarkable. If you take, for example, the public sector has a duty, a legal duty, to produce action plans, to do impact assessments around equality, diversity, inclusion, and produce action plans. Yet 44% of the public sector organizations in our survey say they didn't have one. So who's doing the checks and balances on this? Where's the enforcement of that regulation? So it's really quite remarkable. So yes, then the other sort of key component one then needs to look at is the governance structures, the systems and processes that are there in terms of managing and monitoring equality, diversity, inclusion issues, how it's built into the performance management systems, Those are the elements that will make any EDI strategy sustainable over a longer period. And I think both Anthony and Mark have mentioned culture. Culture change is crucial. You know, I mean, we talk about it as a sort of nebulous idea, but both Mark and Anthony have sort of highlighted where the practical dimensions of culture are, in terms of symbols, in terms of what you do on a day-to-day basis, in terms of agreeing to disagree with people, in terms of making sure that that human component. The bottom line in all of this is really about reinforcing the idea that we're dealing with people, human beings, and it's really fundamental to sort of recognize that how one would wish to be treated, we would want to sort of treat other people in the workplace. I'll leave it there and try and sort of look at sort of exploring some more of these topics with the questions that may be coming. Thank you very much, Jenny.
Brilliant, thanks Lutfur. That was, yes, a bleak picture with those statistics, and the fact that they acknowledge that they're only paying lip service to it. But again, it is about people, it's about engaging them. That's what I think is a great way. When we first designed the Good Business Charter, I did work with Capita to look at the questions and what we ask: how do we pull this out on EDI? How do we essentially make sure that workplaces are inclusive and anyone can bring themselves to work and feel that they can flourish in that environment? So I am now hoping that we're going to have some great questions to bring in. This is your chance to ask Hannah for Capita or Anthony for Aviva, or Lutfur, about anything you like. So here we are. What would you say are the most common factors that have an impact on the well-being of employees in the workplace? So I'll come to you, Hannah, first, if that's okay, since Mark talked about well-being, but I think it's probably something that the other two can answer into as well.
Sorry. Most common factors are quite difficult. I think one of the biggest things that we've all talked about is that consistency piece. So not only do you need to have that holistic view, but your approach has to have a consistency. Now, that's not to say that things do not change, because I think anyone who's on an EDI journey specifically will see change. One of the focus areas for us over the last couple of years has been improving that data. Data is a really difficult thing. You can't represent everybody in your organization unless you know who they are. But actually, because of people feeling insecure for various reasons, they might not want to share that data. So the work that we have to do is to really make sure that we are doing enough work to represent all of the groups so that people are then confident with sharing their data. Then you can start to progress some of those specific topics that are specific to various groups. So I think there is that piece around consistency. We have a culture, we live by values, and although the activities that sit under those may change, the culture and the values doesn't change, and our want to progress and learn and keep going forward doesn't change. It's just the activities underneath that may change.
Brilliant, thank you, Hannah. Anthony, is there anything you'd like to add about what you would say the most common factors?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, and I think it's a really great question, actually. I mean, I think, you know, the starting point is, and I agree, it's really difficult to think about what are the key common factors. All I would say is the common factor is that everybody is an individual and their situation is individual to them. But actually, for me, it's about the key thing is, one, do we have the support mechanisms in place to help colleagues when they really need us? And actually, how do we then, through culture, create that safe space so that actually my colleagues get it, my manager gets it, and actually we also might need to get support from professional, external agencies. But whatever I need, the culture is right, that it understands I'm personal, I'm an individual, I need something at this time to help me, or it could be even help someone in my extended family, but as a consequence of that, it's having an impact on me. So I think, you know, and Hannah, you're probably far more of an expert on well-being, but you know, for me, when I look in my role in terms of not just employee representation but employment policies, do employment policies bring to life the cultural values? Because they are the touch points, and they should bring to life the culture and philosophy of the organization. So things like care relief, time off for individuals, workplace adjustment passports, all of that I think can help support. So for me, it's understand the individual, make a safe space for individuals to be themselves, and have, you know, great support mechanisms internally and externally to help people through.
Brilliant, thank you. Do keep your questions coming. You can either raise your hand if you like, using the little icon at the bottom on Zoom, or just pop it in the chat and we will take them either way. Look, well, this is a great one for you. I'm sure you'll be able to guide us in the right place. Is there advice, best practice guidance on how to compose and develop an equality and inclusion strategy?
Well, at the risk of pointing everyone to the CIPD website, where we've got a whole suite of sort of advice and guidance there, I'll try and sort of summarize some headline ideas. So I think I mentioned the issue about the so-called diagnostic phase of understanding where the organization or a department or a service area is at. So that's really quite crucial, you know, starting off from sort of understanding where the blockages, barrier issues are. And some of that evidence can come from, you know, what staff surveys have already said, in how people feel working in an organization, when people have left, what they've said about working in the organization, and importantly as well, in terms of assessing, you know, the recruitment process from, you know, those people that are able to access the organization, and key, you know, which groups of people are not accessing your organization, what's preventing them from getting access. So understanding where those bottlenecks are is really quite vital. And this is only just the first part in terms of understanding where, you know, particularly unconscious biases within organization exists. You know, we're I think, you know, a little bit, you know, moved on from looking at sort of overt discriminatory practices. I think we'd all accept that organizations have significantly understood that this is not good for business and it's not good for sort of employment, but it's the unconscious bias component that still is, you know, quite taxing for many an organization. And that's what we need to understand, and that's what this evidence review will help to enable organizations to find out. And then it's only then you can sort of look at what strategies can be put in place based on the resources that an organization has. And I always sort of emphasize this, that, you know, we're looking at progress and not perfection. I think that some of the fear components that, you know, organizational leaders have around the DI agenda is, first of all, the language, which is been mentioned by Mark, that, you know, they don't necessarily have the language. But I just sort of encourage people to make mistakes, and that's how you will learn. And, you know, some of the culture wars that we've seen happening out there have not helped in terms of, you know, people making mistakes and then either finding themselves in some difficulty with litigation or employment tribunals. But I think you know, organizations need to be brave, because this is the only way you're going to learn. Hopefully, consistently, organizations won't be making, you know, the same repeated mistakes again. But it's important to start somewhere, and really, it's all about sort of establishing what your baseline is. Don't compare yourself to others unless there's industry comparators out there, but really compare yourself against what you want to achieve, what your customers need, what your employees' issues are, and how they feel working in that organization, and design a strategy and action plan around that. It goes back to sort of that leadership question. You know, the leaders set the tone of what that language is in that organization, how you talk to employees. Middle managers and, you know, the next tier of you know, leaders will only follow what the top tier board level senior leadership team are about. And often I hear this, that, you know, they talk a good talk, but it doesn't permeate in terms of their day-to-day actions. So that burden of responsibility does lie with the senior leadership team within organizations to actually act out what they say externally. And that's the biggest problem, you see, saying one thing and doing another thing.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm taking that. Progress, not perfection. That's what the Good Business Charter is also about, because let's face it, no one's perfect, and no organization is perfect, because organizations are made up of people. And thank you for saying that, Lutfur. I think it is a challenge at the moment, isn't it, with what we see splashed across our news too regularly, you get scared to make mistakes, but we are going to make mistakes because we're people. So I think that's and the other thing I really liked there was this fact that we get the data and that informs our strategy dependent on the size and resources we have. And that's, you know, obviously we've had Aviva and Capita, huge organisations who obviously are going to have more resources than someone on this call who perhaps works for an organisation with 300 staff. But it's all relative, or perhaps someone who's got 60 staff. And so I think that's really useful as well. So another question, although they may be synonymous, how do we reconcile workforce productivity and workforce well-being when they do not improve simultaneously? There we are. Hannah.
I think there is this may be referencing obviously the COVID period where we did see increased productivity due to a level of nervousness and anxiety of people, not necessarily that everyone was happy about the situation that they were in. And I think the important thing there is to be aware of those factors, whether those factors are positive and we are looking at why productivity is increased, or whether those factors are negative, and why your score on wellbeing may have gone down, but your productivity may have gone up. What are the common factors? What are we hearing from our groups? And again, whilst the leaders very much set the tone, it's about making sure that all employees are empowered to have that voice, to voice those concerns, and to have a variety of frameworks to do that in. So we have a structure in which not only are all employees empowered to actually raise those concerns, but there are various groups within the organisation that support and help direct the leadership. So not only do we have those employee resource or network groups, different organisations call them different things, but we already also have a leadership council made up of a very diverse group of individuals representing lots of different communities, lots of different groups, lots of different age ranges. And they help to inform our executive committee. And that's really important because there can be periods of time where we're all floating on it, oh, but COVID's great because productivity was up and the UK was doing really well. But actually people were really struggling, really suffering, and we needed to make sure that we were giving everybody, especially as an organisation, we moved to a hybrid model during that time, had that voice, had that open opportunity to speak, and we had a governance framework that sat around that went as far down as the speak up policy, which you always hope is the last resort, where people can voice those concerns if they think that every other avenue is closed to them, or that they're seeing something that's systemic that they're not believing is being listened to, that they still have another place to go on that. And that's really important, that you look at it when it's good. Why is it good? You look at it when it's bad. Why is it bad?
Brilliant, thanks, Hannah. And do you want to add anything to that, or?
I think, Hannah, I would agree exactly. I think, you know, it goes back to what I was saying in my kind of talk earlier. I think it's about, you've got those vehicles to listen to people, to keep them engaged. And actually, you know, it's about making continuous improvements, but you know, it's a journey and you're taking people on that journey. But have you got various tools, and at some stage you might need to dial one thing up and another time you might need to dial something else down. But I think it's just, for me, it's in terms of, you know, engaged workforce. It's about and living the culture, and actually you can only do that, really, I think, if you're prepared to A, hold yourselves to account, and B, you've got the opportunity where others can contribute to that conversation in terms of hold the mirror up. You can be the voice and the conscience, but also, you know, I would say to the representatives, you're the eyes and ears. So you need to be telling us, what is it that people at the water cooler are really, really talking about? Where are those key pivotal points that actually people feel they are most empowered to have those conversations? So yeah, absolutely would agree.
Brilliant, thank you ever so much. I'm just thinking, you know, we've obviously as a nation got an issue around productivity. Would it be, I wonder, fair to say that if all organisations were caring more for their people and listening to them more, and ensuring that everyone felt welcomed and looking at their EDI, would that resolve a big part of the problem, I wonder? So I think we're running out of time now. It remains for me to just thank you all. I think, you know, one thing I was just taking away there is there can be a nervousness, can't there? There's a nervousness about getting things wrong. I know certainly in EDI, there's a nervousness about saying the wrong thing, getting it wrong and making matters worse. I think even in wellbeing, there can be a nervousness that if we spend too long caring for everyone's needs, then we'll get no work done. But what I hope is the message that you've come away from today is that no, that is not the case. You will make mistakes, but actually as we care for people, as we engage with our people, hear from them through the good and the bad, as an organisation, we will be stronger as a result. And that is why the Good Business Charter is all about championing people, and why our first 5 out of our 10 are all about our people. So I want to thank you so much. Do pass our thanks to Mark, Hannah, but Mark and Hannah, Anthony and Lutfur for coming and sharing your expertise with us. Thank you all those who've joined us to listen in. We will send through a link to all those resources on the CIPD website and Lutfur's slides and a summary of this. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of the day.